the seductress killer. Number 5 is a woman who didn't need a gun to be dangerous. She used her voice, her charm, her body, and she used God. Sheila LaBarre looked like any eccentric middle-aged woman you might pass in a small New Hampshire town. But beneath her eccentricities, the wild red hair, the raspy southern accent, the fiery temper, there was a monster, and it was hiding in plain sight. To the outside world, she lived quietly on a farm in Epping, New Hampshire. But that farm became a graveyard. Her graveyard. Sheila targeted men, not just any men, but vulnerable ones, often younger, often with mental or emotional challenges. She would lure them in, sometimes off dating sites, sometimes by chance encounters. She promised love, safety, and a place to stay. What they got instead was horror. She claimed she was an angel sent by God to punish pedophiles. It became her justification, her sick, twisted excuse for torture and murder. But there was never any evidence her victims were guilty of what she accused them of. What there was blood. In 2006, police received a tip about a possible missing person connected to LaBarre. That led them to search her farmhouse. What they found stunned even seasoned investigators. The property reeked of death, charred remains, bloodstains, and in a burned pile behind her home, bone fragments belonging to 2 young men, Kenny County and Michael DeLog. Neither of them made it out alive. But what truly chilled authorities were the tapes. Sheila had recorded hours of footage. In one, she's heard screaming at Kenny, forcing him to confess, not as something he'd done, but at being a pervert. Her voice is frantic, rabid. His? Broken, terrified. She filmed his final days. She humiliated him, beat him, starved him, tortured him psychologically and physically until he could barely speak. Then she murdered him. Her manipulation ran so deep. Kenny even called his family before he died to say he was in love and safe. He wasn't. He was already living in hell. Investigators believe Sheila may have killed others. There were rumors, missing persons, unexplained bone fragments. But she was only charged with 2 murders. And even that was enough to make her one of the most sadistic women ever held in a U.S. prison. During her trial, she didn't deny the killings. Instead, she claimed insanity. She said God had ordered her to do it. The defense painted her as delusional. But prosecutors showed a woman who was fully aware, in control, and cruel by choice. The jury didn't buy her excuses. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, Sheila LaBarre remains locked away, and she's never shown a shred of remorse. What makes Sheila so chilling isn't just the murders. It's how she weaponized intimacy. She didn't pounce on strangers in the dark. She made them love her. She pulled them in, told them they were special, told them they were safe. Then she broke them piece by piece. She used the language of righteousness, wrapped herself in religious delusions, and cloaked her cruelty as justice. But there was nothing divine about Sheila LaBarre, just pure, manipulative, deliberate evil. In a world of predators, Sheila didn't just blend in. She stood out because she played the long game. She hunted slow, with smiles, with seduction, and with unrelenting control. That's what lands her here. Number 4, Michelle Notek, the House of Horrors, isn't a serial killer in the traditional sense. But her cruelty, her calculated, prolonged abuse, it left a trail of broken lives and silent graves. Michelle Notek didn't kill with rage. She killed with patience. To neighbors in rural Raymond, Washington, Michelle seemed a bit odd, maybe controlling, but harmless. She lived in a modest house with her husband, David Notek, and they often opened their doors to those in need, troubled friends, distant relatives, the mentally vulnerable. She told everyone she was just trying to help. But what happened inside that home was torture. Michelle preyed on the weak, people who had nowhere else to go. She would welcome them with food, a bed, even affection, and then slowly, methodically begin to break them. Her methods were horrifying. She forced her victims to do back-breaking chores in extreme heat without food or water. She denied them medical care. She beat them, burned them, shaved their heads, and emotionally manipulated them until they were no longer themselves. Victim after victim fell under her control. Kathy Lorino, a hairdresser and family friend, moved in around 1991. Within months, she vanished. Michelle claimed Kathy ran off with a trucker. She didn't. She died in that house. Then came Shane Watson, Michelle's teenage nephew. He'd witnessed too much. Started asking questions. Michelle couldn't have that. One day, he was gone. Michelle told people Shane had fled after stealing something. But the truth? David Notek later admitted that Michelle told him to kill Shane, and he obeyed. Then there was Ronald Woodworth, a mentally ill veteran who moved in to get back on his feet. Michelle tortured him relentlessly, forced him to walk barefoot on gravel, burned him with bleach, and humiliated him constantly. He died of his injuries. And just like the others, Michelle had David burn the body. 3 people, all dead, all connected to one address. Yet for years, no one knew. Michelle was a master manipulator. She kept her daughters quiet. She kept David under her thumb. She built an image of a caring woman, even as her guests were being destroyed behind closed doors. But in 2003, her house of cards collapsed. Her daughters went to the police. The truth unraveled fast. Police searched the property, found bone fragments, bloodstains, and testimony from her own family that painted Michelle not just as abusive, but as a predator. Michelle Notek was charged with multiple counts related to the abuse and deaths. But in a shocking plea deal, she avoided trial. She pled guilty to second-degree murder and manslaughter and was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Yes, only 22 years. David, who admitted to following her orders, received 15 years. The public was outraged. 3 people were dead, their lives reduced to ash, literally, in burn piles on Michelle's property. And yet, the woman behind it all was given a sentence with an expiration date. And here's where it gets even more disturbing. Michelle Notek was released from prison in 2022. Despite everything, she walked free, but her freedom may be short-lived. In 2023, the Pacific County Sheriff's Office announced that Michelle could face new murder charges related to one or more of her former victims, and possibly additional ones not yet confirmed. Because there's one haunting truth that still lingers. We still don't know the full extent of Michelle Notek's crimes. How many victims? How many silent graves? How many people disappeared after walking through her front door? Michelle didn't need a gun or a knife. She used trust. She used power. And she used time. She slowly unmade people until their deaths felt like an inevitable outcome. And that kind of evil is far more terrifying than a sudden act of violence. That's why Michelle Notek, the woman behind Washington's House of Horrors, takes her place here. Number 3, Diane Downs, the mother who shot her children. Number 3 is not a serial killer. She didn't torture strangers or lure vulnerable victims. No, her victims were the people who trusted her most, her own children. And that betrayal is what makes her evil on a level few can comprehend. Diane Downs once had the image of a typical young mother. Pretty, confident, always smiling in front of the camera. She lived in Springfield, Oregon, and worked as a postal carrier. On the surface, she seemed to have it all. 3 beautiful children, a stable job, and a seemingly normal life. But behind that smile was something terrifying. On the night of May 19th, 1983, Diane pulled into a hospital emergency bay, screaming for help. Her car was drenched in blood. Inside were 3 children, 8-year-old Christy, 7-year-old Cheryl, and 3-year-old Danny, all suffering from gunshot wounds. Cheryl was already dead. Danny was paralyzed from the chest down, and Christy was clinging to life. Diane told police she'd been carjacked. A bushy-haired stranger flagged her down on a rural road. She said, demanded her car, then shot her and the kids in a frenzy. Her story was dramatic, full of emotion, and she even had a minor gunshot wound to her arm to back it up. But something felt off. Police immediately noticed Diane's calm demeanor. Her recounting of the event seemed rehearsed, theatrical. While her children were fighting for their lives, Diane flirted with hospital staff, asked about her car, and seemed more concerned about her damaged arm than the fate of her kids. And then came the forensic evidence. There was no blood spatter on the driver's side of the car. Highly unusual if Diane had been in the middle of the chaos she described. No signs of a struggle. And most damning of all, the weapon used in the attack? It matched a .22 caliber handgun Diane was known to own, though she insisted it had gone missing. Investigators also uncovered something chilling. Diane had been having an affair with a married man, and that man had made it very clear he didn't want children. Friends recalled Diane saying disturbing things about how her kids were obstacles in her life. And soon, they realized the unthinkable. Diane hadn't been trying to protect her children. She had been trying to get rid of them. Her motive? Freedom. She wanted to live her fantasy life, one without kids in the way. But it was the words of her own daughter, Christy, that sealed Diane's fate. After recovering from a stroke caused by the bullet that nearly killed her, 8-year-old Christy testified in court, her voice shaking, her hands trembling. She looked her mother in the eye and said, "My mom shot us." It was the most damning testimony imaginable. In 1984, Diane Downs was convicted of murder, attempted murder, and assault. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. But the story doesn't end there. Diane escaped. In 1987, she broke out of Oregon Women's Correctional Center and went on the run for 10 days. Authorities launched a massive manhunt, and she was eventually recaptured and transferred to a high-security facility. And today, Diane Downs is still behind bars, still proclaiming her innocence, still spinning stories. Every few years, she comes up for parole, and every time, she blames someone else, refuses to take responsibility, and shows no remorse for the death of her child or the lifelong trauma inflicted on the others. And that's what makes Diane Downs so horrifying. She didn't kill in a fit of rage. She didn't snap. She planned it. She calculated it. And then she lied. To police, to the public, to the world. All while her daughter was left paralyzed, her son traumatized, and Cheryl, just 7 years old, never made out of that car alive. She wore motherhood like a mask. And behind it was one of the coldest hearts the justice system has ever seen. Diane Downs is a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from the outside. It comes from within. And that's why she sits, without remorse, without shame, in a prison cell to this day. Number 2, Aileen Wuornos, the demon on the highway. She didn't wear a mask. She didn't lurk in the shadows. She walked straight into the open. Thumb out, eyes hollow, a fake smile stretched across her face. Men pulled over. They thought they were doing a good deed. A quick ride, maybe a quick thrill, but they didn't know they were picking up death. This is the story of Aileen Wuornos, the woman who brought terror to the highways of Florida and became the face of female rage turned deadly. She's not just number 2 on this list. She is a cautionary tale carved in blood and bullets. Born in Rochester, Michigan in 1956, Aileen never had a chance. Her father was a convicted child molester who hanged himself in prison. Her mother abandoned her before she could walk. She was raised by alcoholic grandparents who saw her as more of a burden than a child. By the time she was a teenager, Aileen was already living outside, sleeping in cars, in the woods, under bridges. She survived by doing the unthinkable, trading sex for food, selling her body to grown men for a place to sleep or a warm coat. And the world just kept passing her by. Fast forward to the late 1980s. She's in Florida now, middle-aged, tired, weathered from years of prostitution, jail time, and abuse. Aileen worked the highways, flagging down truckers and lonely men, offering sex for cash. But something in her had changed. She wasn't just angry, she was full of hate, boiling, ready to explode. And then she did. Between December 1989 and November 1990, 7 men were found dead in Florida. All had been shot multiple times, mostly at close range, execution style. Their bodies were dumped in wooded areas or along lonely stretches of road. No witnesses, no signs of robbery or struggle in some cases. But they all had one thing in common. Each of them had picked up a woman hitchhiking. The killer left behind very little, but she made one mistake. She crashed one of the victims' cars and left a palm print. That print led police to a name, and that name led them to a woman drinking at a biker bar in Daytona Beach. Aileen Wuornos was arrested on January 9, 1991. At first, she denied everything. Then, slowly, the truth came out, or at least her version of it. She told detectives she killed the men in self-defense, that they had tried to rape her, that she feared for her life and shot them before they could hurt her. But police weren't convinced, and neither was the evidence. Some of the victims were elderly. One was a retired police officer. Another was a part-time rodeo worker. There were no histories of violence, no physical evidence of assault, and worst of all, her story changed constantly. Sometimes she said it was self-defense. Other times, she said she just snapped. Later, in a moment of anger, she claimed she hated men and killed them because they deserved it. And then came the recordings. In a sting operation, police convinced Aileen's lover, a woman named Tyria Moore, to call her from out of state. Moore asked Aileen to confess, to clear her name, and Aileen did. On tape, she admitted to the murders. She said she acted alone, that Tyria had nothing to do with it, and that she knew she was going to die for what she did. In court, Aileen unraveled. She raged. She cried. She stared down the jury like a wild animal trapped in a cage. She gave bizarre interviews, claiming law enforcement let her continue killing so they could sell her story for money. She spoke about spaceships, about God, about angels and the Antichrist. But nothing she said could undo what she did. In 1992, Aileen Wuornos was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She spent over a decade on death row at the Florida Department of Corrections. There, she became even more erratic. She claimed guards were poisoning her food. She said her cell was bugged. She stopped all appeals, saying she wanted to die. She gave one final interview wild-eyed and seething, telling the world she was being railroaded and that she'd be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6. And then, just like that, it was over. On October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. Her last meal was a cup of coffee. Her last words? Strange, ominous, unforgettable. Yes, I would just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie, big mothership, and all, I'll be back. Her ashes were scattered under a tree in Michigan by a friend. Her legacy? Etched in infamy. So what made her so evil? It wasn't just the murders. It was the intent, the coldness, the way she admitted it, proudly, defiantly, the way she looked into the camera and said she'd do it again. The seething hatred behind every word, like each bullet she fired was aimed not just at one man, but at all of them, at every man who ever used her, touched her, beat her, discarded her. Some say Aileen Wuornos was a product of her past, that she was failed by society, abused, discarded, and turned into something dark. But that doesn't excuse the blood. It doesn't justify the calculated way she lured her victims, or the silence she left behind, where 7 voices once lived. Aileen Wuornos turned Florida's highways into hunting grounds. She didn't wait in shadows. She stood out in the open, a woman with a gun and a grudge, and no intention of stopping. And that's why she earns a number 2 spot on this list of the most evil women in U.S. prison history. Because sometimes the most dangerous monsters aren't born. They're made, and they walk right up to your car window and smile. Number 1, Gypsy Rose Blanchard, the puppet who pulled the strings. She was small, frail, her voice soft and childish. She wore Disney pajamas and walked with a limp. She was blind in one eye. She used a wheelchair. She had leukemia, muscular dystrophy, seizures, and a mental capacity of a 7-year-old. At least, that's what the world was told. But behind the sympathy cards, behind the charity donations and celebrity visits, something sinister was growing. A lie so dark, it led to one of the most disturbing crimes in modern American history. And at the center of it all was a girl named Gypsy Rose Blanchard. She doesn't look like a killer. She doesn't sound like one. And yet, She takes the #1 spot on this list, not because she killed with her own hands, but because of how coldly, how carefully, and how calculatedly she orchestrated the murder of the one person who gave her life and took it away at the same time. Let's go back. Gypsy Rose was born in 1991 in Louisiana. Her mother, Claudine Dee Dee Blanchard, was obsessed with one thing: control. From an early age, Dee Dee convinced doctors, friends, and even her own daughter that Gypsy was severely ill. According to Dee Dee, Gypsy suffered from leukemia, epilepsy, muscular dystrophy, asthma, vision and hearing impairments, and developmental delays. She shaved Gypsy's head, forced her into a wheelchair, inserted feeding tubes, handed her child pill after pill, diagnosis after diagnosis, all based on lies. The term for this condition is Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a form of child abuse where a caregiver fabricates or causes illness in someone under their care to gain attention, sympathy, and control. And Dee Dee played the part to perfection. Charities built them a house. Make-A-Wish sent them to Disney World. Doctors prescribed endless medications. No one questioned it. Because who would question a sick little girl and her devoted, loving mother? But behind closed doors, that love looked more like imprisonment. Gypsy was kept isolated, homeschooled, told she was younger than she really was, kept in a mental and physical cage. When she tried to speak out, Dee Dee threatened her, beat her, drugged her. She even forced Gypsy to sign medical documents she couldn't read, authorizing surgeries she didn't need. Gypsy was trapped in a false identity. Not sick, but made to feel sick. Not disabled, but treated like she didn't own her own body. She was living a lie, and the world applauded her mother for it, until Gypsy discovered the internet. Late at night, while Dee Dee slept, Gypsy would sneak online. She found a world outside of her bedroom walls. Fantasy, romance, reality, and then she found him. Nicholas Gojan, a lonely, mentally troubled man from Wisconsin. They met on a Christian dating site. Gypsy told him the truth. She could walk. She wasn't sick. Her mother was abusive, and she wanted out. Together, they created a plan. Not a plan to run away. Not a plan to call the police. A plan to kill. On June 14th, 2015, Nicholas Gojan boarded a bus to Springfield, Missouri. Gypsy snuck him into the house while Dee Dee slept. She gave him gloves, a knife, and then she waited in the bathroom, covering her ears. Nicholas crept into Dee Dee's room and stabbed her 17 times in the back while she screamed for her daughter. Gypsy heard it all. When it was over, the two fled to a motel. They mailed the murder weapon back to his home to hide the evidence. They posted on Facebook from Dee Dee's account, writing, "That be asterisk, 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 H is dead." It wasn't long before police tracked the IP address and found them. The world was stunned. How could this sweet, wheelchair-bound girl commit such a horrific crime? And then the truth came pouring out. Gypsy could walk. She had no cancer. Her medical history was a web of lies. Doctor began reviewing records, realizing Dee Dee had manipulated, forged, and coerced her way through the entire medical system. The world's sympathy turned to shock. In court, Gypsy pled guilty to second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Nicholas Gojan, her co-conspirator, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Here's why Gypsy Rose sits at #1 on this list. Because she wasn't just a victim. She was also the director of her mother's death. She planned it. She initiated it. And while she didn't hold the knife, she put it in his hand. Yes, Dee Dee Blanchard was abusive. She robbed Gypsy of her childhood, her freedom, her identity. But Gypsy had other ways out. She had access to the internet. She could speak. She could walk. She could run. But she didn't. Instead, she chose death. She watched a man kill her mother and felt relief. Later, she said she felt freer after the murder. She called prison better than living with my mom. Let that sink in. For some, Gypsy is a symbol of survival, a girl who broke free from a nightmare. But for others, she's something much darker, a woman who manipulated a mentally unstable man into becoming a killer. A girl who smiled in photos days after the murder, who walked around Disney World, knowing her mother's blood was still fresh on the mattress. The truth is, she's both victim and villain, prisoner and puppet master. Her story forces us to ask terrifying questions. How far would you go to escape abuse? When does survival become murder? And can someone truly be innocent if they plan everything? Today, Gypsy Rose Blanchard is out of prison, released in 2023 after serving 8 years. She's free. She's active on social media. She's married. But one thing's for sure, her past and the horror she helped unleash will never disappear. Because behind the frail girl in the wheelchair was a mind sharp enough to plot death, a heart bitter enough to demand it, and a soul forever haunted by what she allowed to happen. That's why she ranks as the most evil woman in U.S. prison history, not because of how she killed, but because of how deeply she deceived. Evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it smiles sweetly. Sometimes it wears hospital scrubs, Disney pajamas, or mother's concerned gaze. The stories you've just heard aren't just tales of murder. They're stories of manipulation, betrayal, and darkness in its most human form. From Gypsy Rose Blanchard's calculated deception to women who use love, power, and even motherhood as weapons, each of them prove that the most terrifying monsters don't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes they live in plain sight. So we have to ask ourselves, what does evil really mean? Is it in the act or the intent? Is it in cold-blooded murder or in the long game of manipulation that leads to it? You decide. But before you go, if this video made you think, shocked you, or pulled you into the darkest corners of the human mind, subscribe for more deep dives into the world of true crime. Like this video to support the channel, and drop a comment below. Which case disturbed you the most? Do you believe Gypsy Rose was a victim or a villain? Your voice matters, and we read every single comment. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, not all killers look like monsters. Some look just like you and me.